As South Africa continues to grapple with the housing backlog, access to water and increasing unemployment, some have called for a different approach to address current socio-economic issues. Qhamani Neza Tshazi, a Sustainable Settlements Program Officer at Afesis-Corplan, an NGO that focuses on alternative development or rather settlement development approaches, says the government's current approach to redress spatial inequality is flawed. He joins us now to unpack this and discuss alternative recommendations. Qhamani, a pleasure to have you on the program.
Good evening to you, Ntantla, and a pleasure to join you today as well.
In your piece, you trace South Africa's spatial injustice back to the apartheid era. Let's look back and also take a thorough look at the present-day problems that have come as a result of this. Firstly, let us talk about the removing the segregation laws in post-apartheid. Has this reversed the effects?
Not entirely. What it has done is it has created a situation whereby our government has been forced to use sort of a redistributive social justice approach, where they mirror the trends of the apartheid development, but they sort of do it in a reverse way. I'll give you an example. There's still some municipalities to this day that use the Township Ordinances Act of 1986. RDP houses still continue to be built on the periphery of cities. The COVID pandemic showed us even more that in many areas throughout the country, there's still no access to water and sanitation. People still struggle to access basic services. And when you check where these areas are, where the common thread throughout all of them is that they are located on peripheral areas in previously black townships. And these are not problems that are associated with your more affluent neighborhoods. And so that's what we've seen. So whereas in the past we've had racism as sort of a tool of segregation, what we're seeing now in the current dispensation with those laws that have been repealed is that money and access to capital has replaced race as a tool of segregation, whereby your ability to pay determines the amount of services that you are likely to receive.
Now, you alluded to the impact of COVID-19. Just how deep does spatial injustice reach?
I think spatial injustice reaches all of us in society. And the sad reality is that even in hindsight, even people who think that because I stay in an affluent suburb, I stay in an area where I have access to all of government's resources, so I'm not affected. But in the long term, you are, because we now have things like load shedding. We have municipalities that cannot afford to pay their bills because of an increase in illegal connections. We have areas whereby municipalities cannot pick up rubbish bins and all those things, etc. So it affects us even in the smallest of forms. But because people sort of take this blind approach to things, it looks as if, oh, because I'm sitting in my cocoon, I'm not affected by the issues that affect the poorest of the poor in South Africa.
When looking at the many people living in informal settlements in the country, most are without basic services. I mean, you look at access to basic water and sanitation. It is quite evident that there is still a long way to go to resolve these problems.
There's still a long way to go. And I think a large part of it is influenced by the fact that there's this huge focus on numbers and development in South Africa, whereby government will judge their success by how many numbers of RDP houses they were able to build. They will judge their success by how many toilets they were able to install in informal settlements in South Africa. Whereas the reality is, most of these interventions have done little to change the socio-economic conditions of the people. I mean, it's an open secret that in some parts of the country, people still sell these RDP houses because they cannot afford the upkeep of them. They cannot afford to maintain them. They are placed in areas that are far away from places of opportunity for them. So it doesn't make sense for them to move to peripheral areas, whereas they had all these services that they needed close to them when they were in informal settlements. So it's sort of a situation whereby people sacrifice their social livelihoods just so to be close to places of economic opportunity. And like you said, the COVID pandemic really brought it to more focus, whereby there was an emphasis for people to use water to wash our hands, to have better sanitation services. But for some people in informal settlements, the concept of basic services is a myth. Those things do not exist to them.
In your piece, you also cite that the blanket approach to the provision of resources is where many problems begin. What is government not getting right?
No, that's a very tricky question, because then one would wonder, what is government getting right? But in terms of what government is not getting right, it boils down to the basics, whereby we have a state that now wants to plan for people instead of planning with people. And what we have been pushing as Afesis-Corplan and many other NGOs would do similar work is that government now needs to start planning with the communities. It's not enough that government wants to think on behalf of communities, but we need to start planning with communities. And we've There's been great programs over the years, such as the National Upgrading Support Program, such as the upgrading of informal settlements, which are really programs that we believe that would save government a lot of money and would be able to impact more lives. Because now you build houses for 10,000 people. It sounds great at the end of the day that you build houses for 10,000 people. But what about the socio-economic impacts that those developments have had in their lives? And you find that half the time we do not even do the socio-economic surveys to check after a development has been enacted. Because once a township is proclaimed, it's tick off as a box and as a tick box exercise to say, okay, we've done this. But there's no checking further to say, okay, how have we impacted the lives of these people that have moved from informal settlement A into township B?
And as we wrap up, how do we find redress to counter the impacts of apartheid spatial planning, not only for the residents of the townships, but also for the overall development of the country?
I think it needs to be a co-ed approach, if I can say, whereby everyone is involved. It shouldn't be a government responsibility alone, I believe. I think the private sector has a role to play. I believe that NGOs have a role to play. I also believe that the greater society as well has a role to play. But from government side, there needs to be a coordinated planning approach, which is one of the things I speak about to say there needs to be a coordinated equity planning approach, whereby if you are proclaiming a new township, then the Department of Health needs to be involved, the Department of Education needs to be involved, and all these other departments that have changed the socio-economic lives of people. And furthermore, the government needs to spend more money on the land question, because in reality, as much as we might dilly dally around the issue, the bottom line is access to affordable land close to areas of opportunity is one of the biggest obstacles. And if government can be able to say, we have found a way to redress the issue of access to well-located land closer to places of opportunity, then we would have won half the battle. And then the other part would be now to say, how do we then coordinate all these various government impacts that are happening in silos all over the place and put them into one room and then coordinate and brainstorm solutions going forward? Because there's no one solution. Like I said, there's no blanket approach. Each area, each town, each municipality, each province as well has its own conditions that are different from other ones. And to plan for those, you would need to understand the underlying socio-economic conditions of that particular area.
Qhamani Neza Tshazi there from Afesis-Corplan.